Hello, my name is Vino Lakani. I work for DailySim Services. In this short presentation, we'll discuss how DailySim, our flagship software, was used to evaluate the hepatotoxicity of a blinded compound. I won't belabor this slide very much. I just wanted to point out that I might not be able to touch on everything, all the great results that we had from this project. Please check out the poster listed here for further information. A few points here about my biography and my background. Again, we can touch upon the website and the email at the end for questions and so on, but this is also available at your leisure. Okay, getting to the subject at hand. Compound V is a small lipophilic molecule with potential therapeutic benefits in patients with obesity. Our clients had an early clinical safety trial in which two of the 16 patients developed an elevated liver enzyme. And so they put up a yellow flag for them. Before they proceeded, they wanted to understand a little bit more about this potential DILI, and our software DILISIM is ideal for assessing that. So they came to us with the broad question of, was it potentially the compound that led to these elevations? And if so, what potential mechanisms are responsible, and what other information might be needed? And so we'll get to those two questions in this presentation. So as I mentioned a couple times now, DailySim is our flagship software. It is a quantitative systems toxicology model. And it sort of integrates three big areas. So it first takes a look at the exposure of the liver to the compound. And that can be assessed with another great software called GastroPlus, a PPK model, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. So once you have the exposure of the liver to the molecule, it also takes in information from toxicity mechanisms. And so we'll look at those three toxicity mechanisms that DailySim includes and the assays that are best suited for parameterizing our model. So it takes that exposure, the potential toxicity from in vitro assays, and our heavily published biochemistry and submodels here integrates all that information and generates an output of whether the molecule will cause toxicity, at what levels and dynamics and so on. So we'll start first with the toxicity mechanisms. So there are three distinct mechanisms of toxicity that DailySim represents. They're bullet pointed here. The first is bile acid transporter inhibition. For these four transporters listed here, we typically go to Solvo Biotechnology to use their assay for assessing the IC50s of the compound of interest to these four transporters. The second is mitochondrial dysfunction. Typically, we go to Cyprotex using their Seahorse XF analyzer to assess any kind of possible mitochondrial dysfunction the molecule of interest might have or create in hepatocytes. The last is the production of reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species. Again, Cyprotex is a great high contrast screen assay that we use for on hepatocytes as well. So for our compound of interest here, compound V, unfortunately gave signals for all three different mechanisms of toxicity that we look at. So it did show inhibition of all four transporters. And in fact, for mitochondrial dysfunction, it showed that there was potential inhibition of the electron transport chain, meaning this molecule is going to decrease the ATP output of the mitochondria, potentially causing cell injury and cell death. And then lastly, it was also showing production of reactive oxygen species. The other input DailySim requires is the liver exposure of the compound. To estimate that, we typically turn to a physiologically based pharmacokinetic model or a PBPK model. In this case, we use the GastroPlus software to build our model and trained that model on single dose clinical data that was provided by the client. And so that's what's being plotted here. Thick black lines are the plasma exposure of patients in that early clinical trial, and the thin red lines are population level PK simulations, again, based off that model that we built in GastroPlus. So what's being plotted here is that model was the same exact model was run for a 1x single dose and a 4x single dose as well, and it matches pretty well the single dose trajectories. So once we fit the data to single dose clinical results, we then validated that same model on multiple dose simulations and multiple dose data. So here on the top, we're showing clinical data from a 1x dose given every day. And on the bottom, we're showing clinical results and population, and the simulation results for a 4x dose given every 3 days. The model looks as a great fit, again, to the previous single dose simulation and the multiple dose simulations. There are a few outliers here, but for the most part, our population level simulations match the average and the majority of the patients in the clinical trial. There was one blind spot when we built the PBPK model, and that is around the liver KP parameter. This parameter describes the ratio of the compound in the liver over the plasma. So the higher liver KP value indicates that more of the compound is getting into the liver than stays in the plasma. And so unfortunately, that data was not available. Typically can be measured in preclinical species, but it was not available to us from the client. So one approach that we used initially was just to use the in silico prediction from GastroPlus. And that gave a value of around 0.3. And that's sort of shown here. Again, the plot we were looking at previously, the plasma concentration compared to the clinic, and then the corresponding liver output is now provided here on the top right. And another way to sort of estimate the liver KP is using an in vitro assay. So we kind of took the data from the assays discussed previously and looked at the concentration intracellularly and the concentration in the supernatant, and sort of took it and got an estimate of around 10 times higher than what was predicted in silico. Unfortunately, the PBPK simulations do not give us any additional insight, so to differentiate between which of these two is more accurate, possibly more accurate. And that's shown here. So here it's not exactly 3.3. We'll look at the higher values moving forward, but even a value of 2.4, we still see very similar plasma concentration output. So the thin red lines from the simulation are not that much different when you increase the liver KP almost tenfold. What does increase and what you would expect to increase is the liver exposure. And so this is playing a very big role, and we'll see that in a few slides. So nonetheless, we pressed forward, still keeping in mind that liver KP value can play a big role. And so that's kind of shown, what are the consequences of not knowing that value, and and sort of where do the two data points that are known about it lead us. And so these are simulation results, just a top line simulation results, kind of giving the frequency of ALT elevations that DILIsym predicts. It takes into account all the tox information that we discussed a few slides ago and the liver exposure that was just discussed. And so, for varying different liver KP values from the in silico lowest to the in vitro highest prediction and a few in between, what is the predicted frequency of ALT elevations for the 1 dose every day or 4 doses or 4x dose every 3 days? And so for the lowest liver KP value, DILIsym does not predict any elevated ALT elevations. That's sort of indicated in this chart, and then a little bit more in detail here with the EDISH plot. EDISH kind of is a top line view of, on the x-axis, the peak ALT level and the peak bilirubin on the y-axis. If the ALT level has passed 3x upper limit normal and moved from the normal range towards the Temple's corollary, then we have a prediction of ALT elevation. And so that's kind of showing that the lowest end. And as you increase the liver KP value at the highest, for example, or even at 2.4, it's predicting a significantly high frequency of ALT elevations, much higher than actually was seen clinically. In fact, around a liver KP of 2.1, we get frequency predictions that were pretty close to the clinical observations. One of the large benefits of doing an in silico modeling, and especially with DILIsym, is their ability to turn mechanisms of injury on and off. And so this compound, as we saw earlier, unfortunately had signals for all three and potential for causing hepatotoxicity using all three mechanisms of injury. It had inhibited the electron transport chain, it produced reactive oxygen species, and it inhibited the bile acid transporters. And so it can be very helpful to understand exactly where, which of those mechanisms is playing the most important role, or which pair of them are playing the most important role, so as to then take steps towards potential mitigation efforts. And so what I'm showing here is a smaller simulation cohort of around 15 simulated individuals. When you have all mechanisms on, as we've been looking at previously, you do see all 15 of those individuals have ALT elevations. And as per our previous slide, the liver KP here is around 2.4, just as a reference. And if you go down looking at which mechanisms have been turned on and which ones are turned off on the, you can go down through this table and quickly come to the conclusion that actually it's the reactive oxygen stress, the production of those, production of reactive oxygen species that is both necessary and sufficient for this molecule to cause hepatotoxicity. So those are the two major insights I wanted to give during this short talk. Again, there's further information to be found on my poster, which you see here. But what we were just discussing was how DILIsym was very helpful in identifying that compound V, the major mechanism of its injury is that it produces reactive oxygen species. That in fact it is both necessary and sufficient for it to do so. So moving forward, those are some, that gives some guidance for moving forward about ways to potentially mitigate ROS might be helpful in getting this compound to be safer. The other thing that we've discussed a few slides ago was that DILIsym was able to identify this very critical gap in knowledge, that the liver KP value is very important in predicting whether this compound is causing that hepatotoxicity or not. And in the absence of doing those preclinical species studies, we can sort of estimate at this stage, based on DILIsym, that liver KP might be around 2.1. And that's based on the table shown a few slides ago, where using that liver KP value, DILIsym predicted a frequent ALT elevation frequency that was in line with the clinical observations. So yeah, I just wanted to give one last way to reach out, sort of to move forward with DILIsym. If you are further interested in our model, we have published pretty extensively on it. A really good place to start is a very recent review article published by Paul Watkins, shown here. I'd like to thank my coworkers and colleagues here. Grant was in parallel in tandem with me for the technical analysis of this project. Jeff was project lead, and both Brett and Scott were very helpful in conversations and sort of discussing next steps with the company as well, a client company. So I'll pause here for any questions.